The history of birth is a long and convoluted one, with the passage of evolutionary time seemingly bringing with it increasing obtrusiveness. If we take the term birth to simply mean the point in time at which the separation and continued existence of an individual becomes completely disjointed from its host parent's anatomy, and no longer directly depending upon it for nutrition, antibodies, oxygen delivery, etc., then the matter of giving birth in the very early stages of life on Earth was as simple as a unicellular organism dividing into two separate unicellular organisms. I would like to be clear that I specifically mean the anatomy, i.e. the physical organism itself. This does not include postnatal care of the offspring. It simply refers to the independence of a growing organism from the nourishing environment of its host's anatomy. The birthing stage could be thought of as the latter stages of cellular division, the very tail end of it when a dividing cell begins to separate into two cells by the formation of a new, distinct cell membrane. This stage, known as cytokinesis, could be thought of as a metaphorical birth, as it marks the point at which the newly developing organism becomes completely anatomically separate from the organism which spawned it, and from this point on no longer depends upon its cellular machinery, so to speak, for its continued existence. The newly birthed cell is an organism which can harness, process, and use energy from its surroundings independently to sustain itself. The development of birthing throughout evolutionary history could be thought of as the prolonging and abstraction of the cytokinetic separation process in a scaled-up form, with the various processes concerned with embryological graduation and separation being segmented into separate, distinct stages and pushed further back in time. Another major difference between more early primitive life on Earth and modern complex multicellular organisms is the onset of maturation. The birthing process in its initial iteration was brief, energetically cheap, and resulted in the formation of another essentially mature specimen immediately afterwards. As life has progressed, however, these previous tenets of the birthing process have become less and less realized. It might be tough to understand exactly what I mean by this, but I hope it will become clear as the video progresses. The multiplication and growth of organisms is of course essential to the propagation of life. Most individuals age, wither away, and die, requiring a replacement for themselves. For the purposes of this video, we are simply focusing on the birthing part of this multiplicative process. That would be the final act of deliverance. The earlier stages of zygotic fusion, implantation, development, and so forth are obviously necessary for birth to occur, but are not the main focus here. Now, what does all this talk of cell division and zygotes have to do with eggs? Well, eggs are perhaps one of the best examples of the truancy of modern life when it comes to this so-called somatokinetic separation, which is a term I just made up, of a complex multicellular organism from its host progenitor. Eggs could be seen as a symbol of a lengthy and postponed birthing process, starkly opposed to the quick and easy births of their ancient unicellular predecessors. As mentioned before, cytokinesis is a simple and swift process requiring virtually no further investment into the offspring on the part of the parent. An egg, however, is similar to a biological incubator, creating an ideal artificial environment within which the development of the offspring can take place. The laying of an egg is a kind of pseudo-birth. Yes, the organism is now separate from its mother's anatomy, and the mother's body no longer nourishes the offspring with its own blood-borne nutrients, but it has not resulted in the existence of a mature or even semi-mature individual who can harness energy from its environment to facilitate its existence. You could almost think of this like a timeline, where the beginning of the timeline is the stage at which an organism prepares to create another life, generating copies of its genetic material, and so on, and the end of the timeline as the point at which said new life has become its own fully fledged, separate living entity, essentially independent of the host's anatomy. Early in the history of life, the birthing process took place essentially at the very end of the timeline. However, as life has become more complex and more resources had to be invested into an organism's multiplication, the birthing stage was pushed further and further back along the line, leaving more and more of the maturation to occur post-birth. This was in part likely done to alleviate the host's anatomy from the increasingly crushing burden of having to share its own bodily resources with its offspring at all times and having to lug it around everywhere it went. Additionally, eggs probably allowed for the colonization of land, as offsprings could be left in the sheltered embrace of warm coastal waters whilst their parents tended to business on land. And herein lies the purpose of eggs. They act almost as a transient replica womb, a biological time capsule in which the offspring can be nourished and left to grow, whilst simultaneously sheltering it from the harsh conditions of the outside for which it may not be quite ready to face. The first true tetrapods needed a reliable and secure way to keep their weak developing offspring on land with them. Their earlier ancestors were also capable of traversing the land, but were largely limited by the necessity of having to lay eggs in water. This kept them on a tight leash, never being able to truly commit to life on this new frontier as they were bound to the pond, always having to remain vigilant over their soft-shelled, jelly-laden eggs floating in shallow bodies of water, never truly free from the possibility of a predator or competitor looking for an easy snack. The development of a tough, substantial eggshell with a moist, liquid-filled interior freed them from this yoke. It allowed them to commit full-time to tetrapoiditude. They were now able to fully adapt for life on land, as they no longer had to remain close to water for the sake of their offspring. Their ancestors were not able to do this, as their soft, insubstantial eggshells would have quickly dried out on land in the harsh sun, effectively cooking their offspring in their own eggs. The immature children need a moist environment to survive and develop. This led to the second great adaptation, which allowed for the development of the true modern egg: a self-contained aquatic environment. Given two paradoxical needs of a liquid environment for embryos to grow, and also the need for the newly burgeoning tetrapods to finally commit to life on dry land, the egg needed to embody the characteristics of its inhabitants' prior home in a more mobile format. Interestingly, when you trace the evolutionary history of eggs and egg-laying, a curious split emerges. Reptiles are believed to have been the first organisms to lay thick, hard-shelled eggs to house their vulnerable offspring in. The reptiles' descendants, the birds, clung onto this tradition. Birds, like reptiles, also hatch hard-shelled eggs. The other branch of reptilian descendants, mammals, did away with this outdated method altogether and had the brilliant idea of keeping the egg inside themselves for the entire gestational period. The birds, however, outdid their reptilian ancestors when it comes to egg pageantry. Bird eggs come in a great array of sizes, shapes, and colors, whereas reptile eggs for the most part are simple and relatively unchanged from their original forms. Something that actually confused me when I was younger was the question of how baby birds were supposed to breathe in eggs. It seemed crazy that birds would lay eggs within which sat tiny fetus birds who had no way of breathing. Surely they were all destined to die. Well, as it turns out, bird eggs have almost imperceptible microscopic pores proliferated throughout their surface. This acts kind of like the hole-studded surface of a butterfly container, allowing whatever is inside to access free-flowing oxygen, and also allowing for the dispersal of carbon dioxide out of the egg. Another method of gas exchange is done via what is known as the allantois, a sort of hollow sac present within the egg. This sac-like membrane exists near an air pocket also located within the egg, which allows for gaseous exchange into and out of said egg. The importance of the evolution of the more land-dwelling, rugged variety of egg cannot be overstated. It functionally allowed for animal life on land. And of course, being that eggs are essentially the vector of life itself, housing the new generation of amniotes, a great deal of importance is afforded to it by evolution as well. As mentioned earlier, there exists a tremendous variety amongst the eggs of the land-dwelling species. Bird eggs in particular are hugely varied. This is thought to be partly due to the fact that birds are uniquely obligate flyers. Their eggs, as a result, are also highly shaped by the physiognomy of the species of bird itself. Birds that are large and flightless, like ostriches, have a different egg shape than, say, a sparrow. This is because sparrows already begin developing in the egg for the life of high-speed soaring that they're destined for. The characteristic shape of the eggs of birds of flight likely evolved that way to allow them to develop large, splayed wings. The elliptical shape allows for the increase of an egg's volume without having to increase the diameter of the egg itself. This has the advantage of allowing for the early development of powerful wings whilst also allowing the eggs to remain relatively small and easy to lay. Remember to think deeply upon this the next time you whip up an omelette or hard-boiled egg. Robbing baby birds of a life of majestically gliding along the skies is hungry work.